People concerned about the need for affordable housing see Boston's recent surge in new construction is both a solution and a problem. Our guest has called for using some of the surge at the high end to get more revenue for affordable housing, as in the home rule petition just approved by Mayor Walsh and the City Council. The idea was fleshed out in a book called Towering Excess. We'd like to welcome the author, Chuck Collins. Thank you very much for being with us, Chuck.
Hi, Chris. Good to be with you.
I'm not going to say you were the sole person on the planet to think about this, but when you started thinking about it, what made that happen in your head?
Well, I think we were looking at the trends in Boston and the growing number of luxury units being built and the number of them that were vacant or owned by shell companies. And in the process, we looked at what were other cities doing. And San Francisco at the time had a luxury real estate transfer tax. And so we looked at that and proposed that that's one of the things that Boston should do. That was 16 months ago. So in the glacial pace of public policy, this is actually a fast development that the city has moved to petition the legislature for a transfer tax.
It's always puzzled me why properties like this, and I'm not just talking about Boston, have such a lot of appeal in the market. I mean, what's driving that?
Well, there are two things I think driving it. One is that wealthy people are moving back into center cities, and so it's not like 50 years ago where capital and investment was moving out of the city to the suburbs. It's really the reverse. And then on top of that, we have this kind of global investor phenomena, which is wealthy investors from around the planet are looking for places to park their money, not even necessarily to live in them, but to hold their value as investments. So there's a lot of international money flowing into coastal U.S. cities, buying real estate just as kind of an asset class, as kind of a form of investment to park their money, basically.
And maybe because other kinds of investment opportunities are not as appealing to. Is that another reason?
Well, it's I think if you're super wealthy, you probably have a lot of money already in the stock market and equities, but you're looking to spread it around. And so real estate, jewelry, art, so real estate ends up, if you have billions of dollars, some of that's going to flow into the stable U.S. marketplace, which compared to the rest of the world is a pretty good place to park and hold money in terms of housing and commercial real estate.
Now, there are other cities, and some of them going back quite a ways, that have had real estate transfer taxes or fees. How is this one different?
Well, Massachusetts as a state has, used to call it the stamp tax. For every time the deed transfers, there's a stamp, and that a little bit of money is charged. Nantucket has, for many decades, had a transfer tax that they use to generate revenue for land conservation. What's different about this is it's very targeted at the high end. So in the case of Boston, transfers over $2 million. So that's going to exempt a huge amount of the market. And some of the petitions coming from other towns, similarly, very targeted at sort of the top 5-10% of the real estate market.
I guess if you take the maximum 2% on the minimum sales price here, which would be $2 million, you get, what is it, $40,000? Is that correct? Do I have the right number of zeros there?
You mean in terms of
what the tax would be for people?
Well, it actually starts at the $2 million. So if you have a $3 million property transfer, you're paying a 2% tax on that $1 million. So yeah, that's right. And it would generate some $169 million a year for Boston, which is significantly more than the city's able to spend both in the linkage program and other direct investments in affordable housing. So it would give the city a lot more resources to address the affordable housing crisis.
What about the effect on the sellers in the market for those properties? Because even if you're only counting from $2 million up, for some of us it sounds like a lot of money, but for people at that end of the income scale, maybe it's not. I mean, what do you see here?
I think at that highest level, it's not a significant bite. I mean, and actually, it's designed so I think it's a 1% tax on the seller, and 1% is paid by the buyer. Many states have much higher transfer taxes. I mean, the state of Vermont has a transfer tax closer to 4% for pretty much all transactions. So we don't tax real estate transfers very much in the Commonwealth, and I think this is a time to do it because real estate appreciation is where a huge amount of the sort of the wealth, the concentrations of wealth have ended up. And if we're very targeted about it, if we're just looking at, the very top of the market, it will generate a lot of money, and it won't have it'll have a negligible impact on the market.
Now, of course, there are also different kinds of property that we're talking about here. On the one hand, you could have these high-rise speculator properties. On the other hand, you have commercial real estate that companies have to pay rent for. So couldn't there be some downside like that as these costs are shifted?
Yeah, again, it's not an annual tax. It's just the tax on the transfer. So again, think of how much properties have appreciated. There's been a lot of windfall, both in commercial and residential. Typically, a real estate commission is about 6%. We're not talking about the effect that that's having on the marketplace. We're talking about a 2% transfer. So it seems to me to be an appropriate way to capture some of that value and direct it to things that the community really needs. I mean, we have an affordable housing crisis, not just for the poor, but for middle class and working class. Really, 80% of the residents of Boston wouldn't be able to afford their home today without, winning the lottery. So that tells us something. And this is a way, I think that the people who've pushed for this legislation see it as a way to generate more money for nonprofit owned housing, first-time homebuyer loan programs, things that help not just low-income and homeless families, but middle-income families be able to stay in the city. And I think that's really the goal, is to use these resources to protect the city's residents.
This has been on the news, and we're talking with Chuck Collins, author of Towering Excess. Chuck, after you came out with the book, I know that this got some attention on the city council. What about the support? I mean, Lydia Edwards was the councilor who sponsored this to begin with. She's always had this interest in housing issues herself. But what about the way that ball was carried on the council?
I think it was almost, there was an immediate understanding that this was a good idea. And you saw Councilor Kim Janey, Councilor Ed Flynn, whose district really represents, the Seaport, Chinatown areas where a lot of this luxury housing is going up. They immediately embraced it. And actually last week, 10 of the 13 city councilors voted for the transfer tax. So I think there was a recognition that this was kind of a really good idea, and an idea whose time had come.
What about what happens after Boston? Because I know this goes to the State House, and you've got a whole different political equation for the whole state, but you also have these other communities that are looking at this as well, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the mayor in the signing ceremony said he wants the legislature to move quickly on this. Sometimes the city of Boston will file a home rule petition for a tax or revenue. We have to get permission from the general court to have this tax. And they say it goes to Beacon Hill to die. I think what's different this time around is you have Somerville, Watertown, Nantucket again, Cambridge, Arlington, Brookline, all eastern Massachusetts communities, but they're all petitioning the general court to be able to levy these real estate transfer taxes. And I expect in the next couple months we'll see towns like Waltham and maybe some Western Mass communities coming on. And then it's no longer just a Boston issue or an Eastern Massachusetts issue. It's really the state. The other thing is that Governor Charlie Baker last January proposed an increase in the state real estate transfer tax to fund climate resiliency, which is a great idea. A lot of our communities we could use, we could prepare for the effects of climate change. And a bunch of housing advocates and environmental people came together and said, great idea, Governor Baker, raise that state transfer tax even more, put it into housing and climate change resiliency, and give communities the local option to add a little bit more, like what Boston and other towns are petitioning to do. So I think of this Boston's petition as part of a movement, really, to kind of move us in that direction. And I think that's really the hope for the coming legislative session.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chris.
Chuck Collins.